Hi, everyone. Well, first, I just want to welcome you. This is our very first speaker event for Summer Session 2020. And what better speaker to kick us off than Ge Wang and his talk titled Technology in Search of the Sublime. Ge, for those of you who don't know, is an associate professor here at Stanford in music and computer science. He researches the artful design of tools, toys, games, musical instruments, as well as VR and artificial intelligence systems. Ge is the architect of the Chuck music programming language and the founding director of the Stanford Laptop Orchestra, and the co-founder of Smool, where he designed the incredibly popular mobile apps Ocarina and Magic Piano. He's also a Guggenheim Fellow and author of the book Artful Design, Technology in Search of the Sublime, which is a photo comic book about how we shape technology and how technology shapes us. After his talk, we'll have a Q&A where you'll be able to ask him some questions. We'll take a few live questions from raised hands in the participants list, as well as some questions from the Q&A itself. During the talk, please remember to just raise your hand or submit a question using the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of Zoom. And now I will hand it over to Ge.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks to all of you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully this will work. And all right. Well, thank you again, Danielle, and thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in and talk about technology in search of the sublime, and it is kind of an artful design story. And so I'll begin with here, and really this is kind of, I guess, where we are virtually. But this is kind of the front of Stanford campus. I work here. I don't mean just at Stanford, but I work in that building way in the back, under those chimneys. And that is Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, and that is abbreviated CCRMA, or Karma is kind of how we pronounce it. And what I do is I design things. That's me back in my office, or we're kind of where I would be if we weren't in sheltering in place and in quarantine due to the current situation. But that's been me for the last 12 to 13 years. And what I do, as Danielle mentioned, is that I design things. I design tools, toys, games, musical instruments, social experiences, VR, and artificial intelligence systems. Much of which is in service of music, and I would say all of which perhaps is in service of some kind of creative endeavor. I write a lot of code, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. But software is, I feel like that's my tool, my craft, and it's something that I strive to be artful at doing. And I did make one of the people that made the Chuck music programming language. This was actually my dissertation back in grad school, and we can talk more about that. I'd be happy to share with you, especially during the Q&A, kind of just, if you're interested, kind of, the circuitous route that I ended up taking to, I guess, be doing whatever it is that I'm doing today. And honestly, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I can tell you that I really enjoy it. And I think for me, that's kind of research, right? I mean, the joke goes, if you knew what you were doing, it wouldn't be research. And I think that there's at least an ounce of truth in that, because in research, you're constantly figuring out, it's not just you have a goal and you're just going to go towards it. You got to figure out what questions to ask in the first place. So, and I think that theme very much fits with this idea of artful design and of technology in search of the sublime, but we'll get there. So I make things like programming languages. So Chuck is a open source, freely available programming language. You can download this if you go to chuck.stanford.edu. It's used to synthesize sounds, make computer-based musical instruments, and you can use it to generate music. I also direct the Stanford Laptop Orchestra. We'll talk about that. And I make mobile apps. as well as lead the Karma Virtual Reality and Augmented Reality Design Lab. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these, but I think the one thing that unifies all of these things that I do is this notion of design, which we might think of as a creative shaping of technology. Some would say that it is the giving of form to function. If you have some purpose in mind, like I need somewhere to sit, or I need to be able to talk to my family, those are kind of, you might call those functions. And design is figuring out what can we build that has form, that can exist in the world, that speaks and addresses those functions. But it gets more complicated because in actually building tools that serves one ostensible function, it often actually does a little bit more than intended. Sometimes it does a lot more than intended, and this is where, for good and ill, we have long-term, possibly unintended consequences of things we make. And I think as designers, more and more, it's actually about not just how do we address the problem at hand, but how do we address these kind of longer-term considerations of how design actually shapes us and how we are as people, as individuals, and in the long run, really as a society. But let's backtrack and just consider just this very central notion of design. And indeed, it's all around us, right? And I think we all design. The moment that you have a kind of a purpose or a function in mind and you go and arrange the world somehow to meet that function, I would call that design. So for example, the aforementioned Chuck programming language, this is designed as a tool for people to use to make music. And in fact, let me try to give you a demo of this. And let me see. Let me go to my editor here. Okay, so this is a Chuck editor. And by the way, if you've never written code before, don't worry. I bet you can follow along to a good extent, and really it's about writing code to make sound. So for example, let's generate a simple signal here. I'm going to instantiate a sine oscillator. That's the type. I'm going to call it foo. I'm going to use this symbol to connect it to the output, basically my speakers on the computer. I'm going to set the frequency of foo to 440, again by using this symbol, which by the way is the Chuck operator, named after, that's what the language is named after because we use this operator so much. And it's Chuck is in the verb to throw kind of carelessly, and so we're chucking 440 to the frequency of this sine oscillator. I'm going to let 2 seconds advance in time. And by the way, I'm going to make this not so loud, so I'm going to put just the volume at 0.25. And if everything works, we should hear. So hopefully you heard that, and that's a sine wave at 440 hertz for 2 seconds. And this is what Chuck allows you to do in these few lines of code. But let's continue with this. And I'm going to copy this twice. And then I'm going to change the frequency here. I've halved the frequency from 440 to 220. I'm going to leave this as 440, but change the duration to half a second. And I'm going to double the frequency from 440 to 880 in this third part and set the duration to 1 second. What do you think we would hear with this code? Okay, hopefully you heard a sequence of tones, and actually by having and doubling the frequencies, we've actually made successive octaves. So every time you double a frequency, you actually go up 1 octave in pitch. Now what we're going to do here is to take this and wrap it into a loop, a control construct. And by the way, this is an infinite loop, which means this is not designed to stop. So this would just keep going. That may not be the kind of music you listen to driving down the road, but it's automation. We've actually just made tones and now we've automated them. And this is what computers are really good at doing, right? They're really good at being precise. They're really good at repetition. They don't tire, so to speak. And this thing would just go on indefinitely until we actually stop the program, as I did. But let's keep going. Instead of hard coding these frequencies, let's instead generate a random number between 30 and 1000 and set that as the frequency of the sine oscillator. Let's do so every second, every half a second, every 200 milliseconds, every 100 milliseconds. So at this point, this is kind of what some people might call computer music, right? This is the sound that, your mainframe computer back in like old sci-fi movies from like 70 years ago, like they're making the sound when they're thinking really hard. But this is still one sine wave, which is with its frequency randomized 10 times a second. Now, if we're to go, we can keep going. This is 10 milliseconds. So 100 times a second, we are changing the frequency randomly 1,000 times a second. At this point, we actually crossed a very critical perceptual threshold where we stopped hearing individual bleeps and bloops. We stopped hearing really a change in frequency. Instead, we just hear this carpet of sound. And that perceptual threshold happened right around 20 to 30 times a second. And it's really one of the few places where auditory systems line up with our visual systems, right? It's like it's how movies and television work. They operate at rates somewhere between, well, if you're watching, say, Lord of the Rings, that is a movie that was shot in 24 frames per second. That's kind of your standard film frames per second. Though interestingly, if you were to watch the Hobbit sequels, those are shot in 48 frames per second. And television, for example, generally is around 30 frames per second. Actually, it depends on which continent you are on. But it's all right around that range. Because faster than that, we don't see individual frames or images. We see a continuum. And for sound, it's the similar principle. So by this point where we're changing the frequency so rapidly per second, we are just perceiving a stable carpet of crunchy sound. And that, again, I'll play it again. That, like, it has lost the character of a sine wave entirely, almost. And so this is what Chuck as a tool was designed to allow you to do, which is to really talk about time and not just what happens in your program, but when. It's a programming language designed around fine, precise control of rates of time, of everything time related. And if you think about it, why do we do that? Well, in this case, it's because it's a programming language for sound and music. And music and sound fundamentally are ingrained and inextricably, they are temporally mediated things, right? You can't, without the passage of time, we don't really think about music that way. Whereas something like still life, a statue or a painting, well, those have a different notion of time. So in some ways, this is a tool that was designed to really capture this temporal aspect of music and put it into a programming language. And the rest of the time, this just looks like kind of your standard procedural imperative programming language like Java or C++. But when you get down to it, it actually has this timing and parallelism that allows you to deal with sound things more readily. So that's Chuck in a nutshell. And everything else actually we're going to hear in the rest of this presentation uses Chuck in some form. So for example, Ocarina, and this is one of the things I actually designed in 2008 as part of Smule, which is a company that I co-founded in 2008. And let me just give you a demo of Ocarina. So it's an app for your phone, and you play it by blowing into the microphone at the bottom here. piece with this. For example, and we can keep going. And so this is Ocarina, and you can ask, hey, what nature of a beast is the Ocarina? As far as design is concerned, is this a toy? Is this an instrument? That's a good question. Well, before we talk about that, let's actually dive a little deeper into the design of Ocarina. The instrument part of Ocarina was originally designed something like this, which is very similar to what you saw on the screen, in that you don't actually see like the casing of an ocarina on the screen of your phone. You just see the functional elements, the buttons that control pitch. The green lines are visualizing when you're blowing into the microphone. And the reason you don't see the ocarina on screen is because this is actually making a kind of a statement about the nature of this app. It's saying your phone is not emulating an ocarina. It's trying to say, in playing this app, your phone has become the ocarina. It is the ocarina, right? And that's a small detail, but it feels different, does it not, right? If you can really think of this as a physical artifact, which it was designed as, because this is not how you usually use the phone. You usually use the phone like that, or maybe like that, or maybe like that, but very few use cases ask you to hold the phone like a sandwich and blow into it to make music. So it is a very physical artifact, and for a rather, most of the time, virtual medium. This is Ocarina in gameplay mode. And when you tilt down, there's vibrato that's added to the sound. So this is yet another thing. It's game, right? It's a game, and the circles that are falling down the middle of the screen are prompting you as to how to play the next note. That's the combination of the buttons you're supposed to press in order to get in that particular pitch. But the timing, the loudness, how you articulate and co-articulate the notes, well, all of those are up to you. And so this is like Guitar Hero and Rock Band. And so it's kind of like Ocarina Hero, but the difference being the sound is not pre-recorded. The sound is generated on board. In fact, in this case, using a series of small chuck programs that are running inside the app. And those chuck programs are specifying the sound in response to the user interaction that's coming in from multi-touch, from the accelerometer, and of course from the microphone. And it's actually just detecting the microphone signal and doing some signal processing on the microphone signal to actually get a read of how hard you're blowing into the phone, and that's used to articulate the sound. So that's kind of in a nutshell how Ocarina works. But back to this question: is it a toy? Is it an instrument? Is it a game? And well, I would say you could say it's none of the above. I don't know what it is, or you could say it's a little bit of all of those. It's a toy in the sense that it is playful. It's unexpected. It's like a joke, right? I mean, it's like your phone. You're not supposed to be blowing to your phone to make music. That's silly. But I think the joke here is that it actually works. And so you could pull this out, I don't know, if you're waiting for your food at a restaurant back, I guess, pre-COVID-19 days. And you might pull this out, and it might be an icebreaker. It is playful. That makes it, I think, possibly a toy. What makes it like an instrument is that this is something you can get better at. It's something with practice you can not only get better at, but you can make playing each song something of your own. It's expressive in that sense. So it's like an instrument because there's a craft associated with how well you can play this thing. And it's like a game when we go into this mode where there's a clear goal of like, well, I would like to play this song, I'd like to get through this song. So I think in that, games are actually a little different than toys, in that toys is like more open playfulness, and games have like a directed purpose to it. So in a way, Ocarina is a little bit of all of those, or maybe it's none of the above. I don't know. But there's another dimension to Ocarina on top of all of those, and that is a social dimension. So in Ocarina, you can listen to other people belong to their phones from around the world. So that's someone playing O Shenandoah from the East Coast. Ah, here's someone playing the Legend of Zelda theme song from Indonesia. Here's a question. Who are these people? Well, I don't know. The app doesn't know either. This is what you might call an anonymous social network mediated by music, right? It's a very different kind of social network in the sense that identity is not the emphasis here. In fact, it's deprioritizing identity in support of something else. And I think that something else might be, I don't know, I think of it as a more authentic but small form of social connection, just a sense that you're connected with the rest of the world. And I think the anonymity in this case is actually really interesting because not knowing who they are actually makes the experience, in my view, more interesting. Because it makes you wonder. It's like, who is that? Who's that playing Final Countdown from Korea? I don't know. Like, these are questions that if you had like an actual hard answer to, it might not be that interesting. But I think it's interesting for your mind to imagine what's going on there. Is there a traveler that's who there, or is Final Countdown just a popular song in Korea? I don't know. The other part is the heart you see at the top left of the screen here, and that's like a like or a love. But the difference here is that it's a one-way street. You can love, but you can't actually see how many people actually loved any performance you did. And in that sense, I mean, I guess Instagram has been thinking about trying this, and they implement this, and they take it away and they put it back, but it changes the dynamic of the interaction, right? If you know that this thing anyone's gonna see this thing, even if you hit the button, the only reason you're ever hitting that button is because you actually like it. And so all of this is this exploring this idea of things done for, I don't know, accolades or approval versus this idea that you're doing things because it's interesting in and of itself. And so I think this, in a simple app like Ocarina, there are actually all these questions that come up in the design. And of course, this was engineered. There's a lot of code. There's front end for the app, and a lot of code in the back end, a lot of signal processing, a lot of interaction design that went into this. But none of those can escape the question, why are we doing this in the first place? What is this trying to do? Why are we shaping technology in this way? And is this a good use of technology, right? And the hope is that you shape technology not only to solve problems, but in solving those problems, you're actually thinking more holistically about how the thing you make is fitting into, I don't know, like kind of a world you wouldn't mind living in, that you would really love to live in. I think that's artful design. So with this, you can see that artful design actually, there's a bit of philosophy in this, but it's a practical philosophy, right? And for example, like this is another philosophy I think that underlie certainly the globe in Ocarina, is that technology should create calm. This is a quote by Mark Weiser, who is to this day regarded as the forerunner of ubiquitous and pervasive computing. This idea that computers would be all around us, more or less invisibly helping us with our daily, lives. I would say we are only partially successful in that yeah, we have technology kind of all around us, but they're not so invisible because this thing is still, it's really in our faces much of the day, as are a lot of other kinds of technology. But this technology should create calm. This is a remarkable statement in that it's not saying, hey, technology is going to solve all our problems, or that technology is going to create wealth, but rather technology should create calm. And I read that calm is to mean a kind of inner peace. This is a review left for Ocarina in the iTunes App Store 11 years ago, from an Ocarina user in 2009. This is my piece on Earth. I'm currently deployed in Iraq, and hell on Earth is an everyday occurrence. The few nights I may have off, I'm deeply engaged in this app. The globe feature that lets you hear everybody else in the world playing is the most calming art I've ever been introduced to. It brings the entire world together without politics or war. It is the exact opposite of my life. Deployed US soldier. So I have to say that as an app designer, the reason we created this app is because part of it is because we do believe that music making is good. It's a kind of values-based motivation to build something. It's just, we think music making does a person good, and let's try to enable people with tools to make music. But this is something else, right? This is something else that we did not expect, that something we made brought just even a momentary sense of peace to another person. And I will note here that Ocarina did not in any way practically help this person. Ocarina is rather useless in a practical sense, in that it did nothing to pluck this soldier from whatever hell they found themselves in. But it did, kind of like art, lift them momentarily out of that world into a gentler version of that world, at least in their mind. And I think that's to say good design is something that enables us. But great design, I think, is something that tries to understand something about who we are. Great design tries to understand us. And if you think about this, I think for me, this is what makes design artful. It's not making something pretty or like pleasant to look at or to use. That's maybe part of it, but that's such a small part of it. The greater part of it is when we design things that makes you feel understood. Like you're understood by your favorite song. Like you're understood by, I don't know, like your favorite interaction with another person, your favorite movie. Like these things don't just entertain us. They don't just enable us. They understand us. So I think for me, artful design is actually synonymous with design that understands us. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and give you a few more examples of the things that we do in search of really technology, in search of understanding. And that understanding, I think we'll get to this notion of the sublime, right? And this is the Laptop Orchestra at Stanford. Stanford Laptop Orchestra, SLORK, SLORK. We have like kind of funny, silly names for all the things we do. A lot of it happen to be like 5 letters. It's like Karma, SLORK, Chuck. We have MOPHO, which is MOPHO. It's the Mobile Phone Orchestra. SMU, all of these things, I don't know why with these 5 letters, in many cases acronyms, but here we are. Laptop Orchestra actually has a number of laptops, of course, but each laptop is paired with an audio interface that gives you multi-channel control over the audio. It's sitting on a breakfast tray, which we got from IKEA. We sit on meditation mats and pillows, and the sound comes out of a hemispherical speaker array you see on the left there. And the hemispherical array, well, its job is to keep the sound generated by the laptop, is to actually make it come out, but to make it come out in a way that's local to the instrument, to the laptop, to the person playing the instrument. And this locality is actually really key because if you think about it, it's another physical dimension of musical instruments. If I were to play, like, I don't know, a ukulele in a room, in the same room with you, you would naturally not hear the ukulele from speakers around the room unless it's amplified. You would just hear the artifact as sound is coming from the artifact. Well, that's what these hemispherical speaker arrays are. That's what they were built to do. And in a way, it's precisely because that's how we hear sound, physical sound in the physical world, and that's how we hear traditional acoustic instruments. So the Laptop Orchestra, even though it has a lot of laptops, it's actually not letting go, but rather cherishing this idea of instruments that have like a identification in space of sound making. And in a way, we're trying to explore what it means to make computer music and to make computer music together And the other way, we are saying, hey, we value physicality and the physicality of sound like traditional acoustic instruments. Can we merge them? And that's really the premise of the Laptop Orchestra. This is just one excerpt from over now 200 pieces done in the Stanford Laptop Orchestra. So in this particular piece, the players are using an interface that's sensing the location of their hands in 3D space. And they're, in a way, it's kind of after this gesture as if we're pulling sounds out of the ground. That's the kind of the premise of the interaction we're seeing here. And this, on the other hand, is a totally different instrument. This is the Laptop Accordion. Okay, so how does that work? Well, if you thought, I wonder if that works by the front side video camera on the screen, and it uses a computer vision algorithm called optical flow to actually track how slowly or fast is closing the laptop screen, and that's controlling basically a sound synthesis process on board on the laptop that's generating the sound. Well, if that's what you were guessing, you'd be right. That's kind of how this works. And so it's well, if you think about it, it's like the Ocarina, right? Like this, how should we put this? This, like the Ocarina, is something that literally nobody asked for. People were like, you know what we need? We need to be able to blow into our iPhones and make music. We need to be able to put our laptops on our laps and actually open and close it like an accordion and play like an accordion. No, like nobody asked for that. In fact, if you took a survey of like, hey people, what do you think you need? What should we build? I would say that this might not bubble up to the top of the list as things that we should build, right? And this is the part where it's, it goes back to the question, why do we design things? Sometimes you design things because people really identify there's a need to design something. There's a problem to be solved. Other times you design things because you've observed the world. You feel its pulse and you feel like there's something that no one is asking for, but you might try to make anyway, and to see if that provides something new, a different way to look at the world, a different way to process the world. So I would say the Laptop Accordion is kind of like a spiritual successor to the Ocarina in that it's a very unconventional use of a conventional computing device. And it's something no one asked for, but perhaps it's interesting because, well, it gives your mind somewhere to go. And then there's the VR lab, where in the VR lab we are asking a series of questions while building a ton of things in VR using software, actually using, I'll tell you what we actually use, but this is part of my research group at Karma at Stanford, and that's the Music Computing and Design Research Group, which I started when I got to Stanford as a professor in 2007, which continues to this day. So in the VR lab, the questions we're asking is, what does it mean to design artfully in the medium? What are VR's artistic, philosophical, and humanistic implications? What new musical interactions and instruments are possible? How will we play music together in a virtual space? How to design novel tools for expressive VR? And Tunity is actually Chuck, the language for music, as a plugin in the environment Unity. So those of you making video games or other things using Unity, this is actually a way to get expressive computer-generated sound and music playing in a very really flexible way with what's happening in Tunity. In fact, you can drive your Tunity scene entirely with accurate, precise timing from Chuck. And of course, you can sonify everything you want. So it's actually a really nice tool for building things, including things in VR. And finally, how might we design immersive virtual environments that encourages play, stillness, and calm? And the way we go about answering these questions, yeah, we identify the questions, and then we just go try and build a lot of things. Once we have ideas, a lot of the ideas come from, what if we did that or tried that? And then we think about, and then we come back and reflect on what we build and be like, what did that really mean? So it's kind of this iteration process of, figuring out where our interests lie, trying things, and then coming back and I think reflecting as much as we can and as broadly as possible, thinking as broadly as possible about what we've done. This is a foot piano. So Marina, who designed this, she has sensors actually on her feet. And of course, if you've seen the movie Big with Tom Hanks, that was the direct inspiration for this, where you're literally like prancing around on this virtual piano keyboard and playing some tunes. This is a two-person violin. In fact, this was just a prototype. This is the first time Kyle and I tried this thing in tandem. So Kyle is under the HMD, and I hold the controller, and the more I move, the louder the sound gets. So any movement is translated into energy that's injected into the system. So that was our first. And so, by the way, so check out Tunity, which is Chuck for Unity. If you just Google Tunity, you should be able to find it. Or if you just go to the Chuck website, chuck.stanford.edu, you can find this. And it's a free plugin for Unity that anyone can download and start playing with. This is something else that's made with Tunity. Also, both as a desktop as well as a VR experience. This is Kung-Woo Kim's MIDI.city. Kung-Woo Kim is one of my PhD students at Karma, and who is exploring the artful design of everything from video games to VR. In this case, he's built a Tunity. I'm not sure if it's a toy or an environment, but in this environment, all the different buildings, the Ferris wheels, and everything makes sound or has some function in controlling the sound. You can kind of see all the graphics and sound line up. And that's because this is timed with Tunity. The sound are generated in Chuck. And Chuck is actually controlling the timing and the graphics as well. Now, when the city really gets going, we can actually go to the moon. On the moon, we see rabbits that are making rice cakes. And as they start making rice cakes, these chord trains come out. And they start kind of flowing through the city. When I look at this, I'm thinking to myself, hey, this is a really nice place. Or at least a very nice concept of a place. I wouldn't mind living in a place that made me feel like that. UFOs come out of the sky. They're not here to hurt anyone. They're here to, I don't know, play music together. And at the end of the evening, everything peacefully shuts off, ready for the next day. And the UFOs kind of just go, I don't know, onward in their journey. So that is, that was VR. That was also kind of what you could do with Chuck and Unity together. And this is also just more of the kinds of artful design that we do. But again, it's trying to design things that offer a kind of understanding really about ourselves. And in a way, if you think about it, that's what art, I think, tries to do. And even when art fails to do that, it is still art, right? Art seems to be our attempt to earnestly try and mostly fail at understanding ourselves. But it's the wanting to understand ourselves and then going to actually do something, I think that makes something artful. Um, and to conclude, what does all this mean? And what are we really after here? And what does it mean for technology to be searching, to be in search of the sublime, to be in search of understanding? Well, I would say design is all about choices, right? You're giving form to function, but that means there's a set of choices you got to make and how you're going to actually do that. If you believe that, then I think the question would naturally follow is that how ought we make these choices? Put another way, what does it mean to design ethically, right? Is the ethical shaping of technology mean that we design things that do no harm, do no evil? This seems like a worthwhile goal, and certainly this is very difficult to do, but this seems like a very, very necessary thing to try to do. But this also seems different than this notion of, well, do good, right? If you think about it, a person going through life just simply, and very, even though it's not easy, to just go through life doing no harm. That seems like a very different kind of person who goes through life trying to do good proactively. In fact, that seems like a world of difference between those two concepts. And the way we might maybe integrate those is with this following question: how do we want to live with our technologies? And that actually is also an ethical question, right? It has to do with the decisions we make when we shape the technology. And anything that has to do with this idea of, well, how should we do it? How ought we do it? Why should we do this? Actually, we're very well might be getting into ethics, which is way broader, in my opinion, than let's make sure we do no harm. It's actually about forwarding a vision for, well, what does it mean to be good? And what is a version of the world that I would like to live in? And how do I reconcile that productively, in a community where people have similar but also very dissimilar values, right? These are all ethical questions, especially when it comes to design. So for me, design actually is these two legs. One leg you might call the pragmatics. That's the practical dimension. Then there's the aesthetic dimension. The pragmatic dimension basically addresses how we live, whereas the aesthetic dimension addresses for what we live, kind of what makes life interesting and rich and worthwhile and meaningful. And design is when you can seamlessly as possible put these two things together, where you really can't tell where one ends, where the other began. You can't just kind of graft one onto the other. You got to kind of do it in a way where it speaks to both simultaneously. And this is all to say there has to be an artistic leap on the part of the designer that results from seeing and feeling the world at large. Designers are less problem solvers and more artists, philosopher, engineers of useful things that understand us, right? And for me, I was educated as an engineer. I studied computer science in undergrad. My PhD is in computer science. My current appointment at Stanford has been in music with a courtesy appointment in computer science. So I'm kind of like, I don't know, I guess I'm one of these like citizen of no place, so to speak, in that I'm kind of an other, right? I'm always I'm somewhere in between, but not even in between. I'm just other. And so for me, I think tomorrow's engineer has to be much more than a specialist, because we're trying to make things that understand us, that is in search of the sublime understanding of who we are. Tomorrow's engineer, I think, has to be a kind of technological artist, a moral ethical inventor, a system designer that can contextualize what we make into the world for which it's designed. To understand the social, cultural, historical dimensions and contexts, and how things we make interface with those contexts, and how the things we make creates new contexts. I think that's really the philosophical and the humanistic role of designers and engineers in 2020 and moving forward. We can no longer be, we should have never been, technicians, who are just here to solve specific problems, because the way we solve specific problems have long-term, large-scale societal impact. And so in terms of then educating ourselves, what does that mean? So in the book Artful Design, I talk about kind of maybe what that might look like. In higher ed, we have this notion of an I-shaped student, like the letter I, This is a person who just gets a narrow but deep education. And this is the kind where like, well, this is not optimal, because if it's narrow, even though you might have a lot of disciplinary mastery, you might not have the tools to take into account the social, historical, cultural context into your work. So then we think about the T-shaped students, like the letter T. You got some depth, you got some breadth. In artful design, I talk about the idea of a pie-shaped student, where in one leg there's disciplinary expertise. For me, that was computer science. On the other leg might be something like a domain expertise. For me, that was music. For someone else, it could be public health. But the bar at the top, this horizontal bar, for me is the aesthetic lens. It's the philosophical, artistic, and moral lens that gives broader meaning and context in bridging the two legs. And isn't this the kind of person, I don't know, that we should be educating? This is the kind of person that we ourselves might strive to be, right? This is the pie-shaped person. And by the way, all the things I talk about, I've put it into a book, a comic book, as Danielle introduced in the beginning. And it is a comic book. It's like a 488-page comic book, photo comic book, where every page is like this. And we talk about the design of buildings, of school supply, engineering, audiovisual design, designs of instruments, design of artificial intelligence, and games as more than modes of entertainment, but modes of expression and vehicles for reflection, to social design. What does it mean to design virtuous social tools, right? And actually, if I may, right, this it looks something like this, and if you flip through it, it is like, the entire thing is just a comic book, and in a way, it's a design thing. This thing itself is an act of design, because by choosing to make this a comic book, I think I've also shaped how this medium would be read. I shape also what kind of things I could actually do and I cannot do because of the medium that I've chosen, right? So, this itself is kind of, it's trying to, I guess it's the book trying to, in a sense, walk the walk of what it's trying to talk about. And that the medium does ever shape the message. Now, back to social design, one last example. In 2011, in the wake of the earthquake and tsunami disasters in Japan, a woman reached out from Tokyo with a rendition of Lean On Me. In this app, at the time was called Glee, after the television series, you could, like in Ocarina, hear other people sing, but you could also choose to add your voice in a +1 kind of way to the chorus. And so when she sang this rendition of Lean On Me, over a couple of weeks, 4,000 people, one at a time, joined in to form this ad hoc worldwide chorus. Sometimes in our lives, we all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. So, this is all to say what we make ends up making us, right? The things we make actually boomerang back to actually shape us. And this is what I mean when we think about technology. How do we shape technology, and how does technology shape us? Well, it's a reciprocal relationship that we have with the things we make. And this, in a nutshell, is kind of what I work on and why. It's, for the lack of a better term, I think it's a kind of design for flourishing. And flourishing, not just human flourishing, but I think flourishing for everything. That includes the environment. That includes, maybe includes animals, other life forms. Maybe includes, I don't know, one day artificial intelligence. I don't know. But it seems like to think about what it means to flourish could be a motivation to drive the kind of things we design and how we design them. And so this is Technology in Search of the Sublime. And I want to make just one more invitation, is for the weekly Zoom series that I'm holding. And yesterday we actually talked about the design of video games. artful.design/TV. Register and join us every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, and for a discussion on different topics around artful design. And finally, you can find all of this and more just at this kind of one umbrella website, which is artful.design. And with this, I want to thank you again for having me, and love to discuss. And if there are any questions, I'd love to take some and think through them together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ska. Now we're going to begin our 15-minute Q&A. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. First, we're going to go ahead and start with some live questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I will select some questions from the participants list. We'll take one question per person. When I call on you, please unmute your microphone. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, so our first question comes from Hannah. Go ahead, Hannah, unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I'm so inspired. I have a question for you regarding Stanford itself. Do you work within the design school, or do you work with anyone in the design school? And what has been your experience there, if so?
This is a great question. I have a lot of friends in the design school, and there are a lot of wonderful people in the design school, but I don't directly work within the design school, even though I think my work is very compatible with it. And in a way, like, I think I have a compatible but different way to think about design, right? I mean, in the D school at Stanford, we often think about, right, like it's the emphasis is on like process, and how do we really get at the needs that people have, and how do we address it. I take a somewhat different approach, and the emphasis is really on aesthetic alignment. Like, are the things we build like really aligned to a notion of what we think is good? And it's kind of this aesthetic ethical alignment of what we build, but the two can be used in tandem. And actually, the way, I've actually never taken a design class in my life, I don't think, as a student, even though I'm teaching nothing but design classes now. For me, design just, it's not, I don't know, it is, it's one of those things where, like, because I can't put it simply, it's probably why you end up writing like a 500-page comic book. But for me, design is something that you can really learn in crafting anything that you're interested in doing, and then thinking and reflecting about what it is they're doing. For me, I'd really learned design by studying computer science, and all the projects that asked me to make things, from calendar systems to computer graphic systems to, for my final project in my AI class back in undergrad, I made a counterpoint generator for music, right? And it sounded awful, but I learned so much from it. And so, for me, like, design has to be paired with a craft of doing something, whether that's coding, whether that's building something, whether it's hardware, whether that's actually policy making. That's a form of design. And it also has to be in tandem with, I think, this broader contextual view, which means that I think, to be a good designer, you also should also be a kind of historian, a kind of philosopher, if you will. You should be an artist, which means you should, seek out these things and do these things just as much as you seek out whatever your craft is. And so this is, again, going back to that pie shape. So for me, like, I study, I mean, for me, my history is I studied computer science in undergrad. That was at Duke. I studied computer science in grad school. That was at Princeton. But my advisor was jointly appointed. He was in computer science, but he had a second appointment in music. That was Perry Cook. And from him, I learned that it was okay to make things because they're interesting in and of themselves. And because that actually sometimes serves us more honestly. And the thing about design is, especially as it relates to technology, is not everything is a problem to be solved. Not everything can be solved. And the things that are problems to be solved aren't necessarily solvable by technology. For example, if you think about prison reform, like, you might be able to build an app for that, but there's truly no app for prison reform. That's not something you can just make an app for and suddenly the problem goes away. I think that's a human problem. That's a social problem. that's a social justice problem, right? So um, there are things that we can do with design. So this perspective is actually something you kind of have to get holistically by being interested in like just a wide variety of things. So I don't know if I'm horrible at actually answering questions directly, but I hope I got to a bit of what you're asking. And thank you for the question.
All right. At this moment, I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to go ahead and jump to our Q&A. We had a question from Lee Pham, and the question is, how do you test your design for bugs and errors, and what's your quality control measures?
That's a great question. Well, from a pure like technical point of view, yeah, I test for bugs and errors just like any software engineer. It's like you just got to try a lot of stuff. But the real test is like, is this thing good? That's a holistic qualitative test. So that's even if like the thing works as intended and there are like, let's just say no bugs that pop up, that no bugs that you know of, and things seem to be working well enough. But then the real test begins is like, does this thing actually work, right? Is this thing the right thing for the time, for the people? And and let's think as broadly as possible about the implications of putting this thing out in the world. Is it going to, certainly let's hope it does not do harm. Let's minimize that. But does this do any good? Right. And so to test something like that is tricky. Part of it is you do have to, you could try to run user studies. I would say that works only sometimes because people are just awful at telling you actually what they really want, is what I've found. People are not great at telling you, like, for example, who's going to tell you, what I really need in my life is to stop feeling so lonely. That's not a question that's not the answer that easily people will give if you're like, hey, we're building an app. What do you need? People can't, there's some deep human things that you can't really put into words easily, and I can't put into words easily. And so I think the way to evaluate design is actually might be a way that you might evaluate artworks as a maker of the artwork. And that is through critique, through self-critique, but also through group critique. As you're building it, before you're building it, after you've built it, and you kind of observe people using it. And ultimately, like for me, like a good test of any design, like art, is just how does it make you feel? Like on some deep level. Does it make you feel fulfilled or does it make you feel a little empty? Like if it makes you a little empty, I think I mean that's you think might be bug free, but there's a huge much bigger bug that you have to contend with. And for example, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but like truth be told, I think I've been on Facebook for I don't know how many years. It is the most empty experience I can think of in a software that I've used for so long. It gives me no joy or meaning. And I'm there because I feel like I'm kind of manipulated into it because all my friends are there. And the thing was designed to engage me. And because engagement, I understand, actually is what is being monetized by Facebook. So I'm calling out Facebook because I think they deserve to be called out, especially at this moment in time. That would be a design that you need to evaluate in a measure other than technical. You need to evaluate that on a social level. Like, what good is this doing? What harm is it doing? And even in the best case, let's just say there's all the things that we find wrong with Facebook. Let's just say those things let's put those aside temporarily and be like, is Facebook actually good for us? For 2 billion people to spend, I don't know, an hour a day on this thing, what does that actually get these 2 billion people? That kind of question needs to be ruminated on and over a long period of time. And it's not something that you can just run a test and be like, I think this is the answer. So I think the real answer here is that there is no easy answer. And I would distrust any answer that would claim that there's an easy way to test design because design has to be tested holistically. Great question.
Yeah, great. And that actually feeds into our next question about connection. So we have Nicole who's asking, how has the pandemic made you think differently about how technology can connect us all?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Certainly the context has changed. right? It's all about design is all about context, and the context changes. Suddenly, the things that seem kind of just playful or kind of useless before, beyond being playful, it's just actually playful is useless. It's kind of part of the definition of play is that it's not supposed to be productive, which is what makes playing so wonderful. Um, but a lot of these things that seem like just kind of useless suddenly are like, wow, this is really useful. For example, any form of kind of remote communication, such as this very medium we're using now, it seems like, well, if we didn't have this, there's just so many things that we cannot do. And there's a lot of things we cannot do that this medium doesn't address. But this, the medium of kind of remote communication, of whether it's Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or Google Hangout, all of these things actually are finding new affordances because the context is drastically different. So is actually in my area. So is network music, which was seen as like, okay, this is an interesting fancy, and there are people doing interesting work there. But now it's like, ooh, without this, how can we play music together? Even try to play music together in real time? And so the context has changed. And for me, actually, it's not really, connection is definitely something that we value. At the same time, I feel like this pandemic has made me feel like this is actually also an opportunity to consider solitude. How do we live with ourselves in solitude? Even if solitude means you're living in a household with like 8 other people, that's still a form of solitude. These are the same people you're kind of, I don't know, socially entombed with, so to speak. Um, and how do you live together? And so for me, actually, pandemic has been a chance to think about craft, the things that make my life interesting and worthwhile to me, uh, and what are the things that make me happy. And I think things like bread making, gardening, like and the things that you hear people do all fit in that category. Um, there have been embroidering, people kind of going making origami. Like it's not about making something spectacular. It's about making something that you're interested in. And I think the pandemic, I think, is, if there's some small silver lining, it's it's the realization, it's a re-realization that craft is important to us. But the thing about craft is, it's even without a pandemic, it's good for us, right? To actually have a passion hobby is one of those things that gives life meaning. Um, so for me, actually, beyond the obvious needs that have arisen, I actually don't think differently about it. I think technology very much the same way as I've done before, but I think about myself a little differently. And I think about my relationship with others a little differently. And that I think, the people who are alive and conscious now in 2020 is going to remember this pandemic for the rest of our lives. We're going to have a reference that is shared, that we're going to be able to draw upon and to think back to, for really the rest of our lives, I think. um, and I hope that makes us appreciate some of the things that are good always, and the questions that actually aren't just specific to this time, questions of like what's good for us in general. So don't know if I answered your question, but it's a great question.
And we have a couple questions that were related to, one question was, do you teach any classes here at Stanford? And then the other question is from Erin. She's asking how students can better craft their education in a way that enables them to develop a pie-shaped cognitive style and become tomorrow's designer. What should we do differently with our time at Stanford and beyond?
It's a great question. Let me see if I can try to answer these in that order, actually. So I teach a couple of courses. I teach a course on just music computing and design. I also teach a course that is not in music, but just it's a thinking matters course, which is a first year critical thinking course called Design That Understands Us. Um, and that's Think 66. So for those of you incoming, or I think even if you are a frosh this year, you can still take the course next year. It's offered in the winter. And also teach things like computational algorithms and Stanford Laptop Accordion, a mixture of kind of computer music courses and this kind of critical thinking course. And I think this is where I think design, this is in a way is very much geared towards everyone, including engineers, including humanists, social scientists, natural scientists, and thinking about that. Now, regarding the pie-shaped student question, um, like how to be a pie-shaped person, right? And how to have this, I guess, a pie-shaped cognitive style, as you've mentioned. I think this is about like there's no recipe for doing this. This exactly is a kind of cognitive style. It's an awareness that you would have, and the actionable things you would have is one to have this awareness that actually to be a good designer, to be a good engineer, I need to seek more than disciplinary expertise. It's not about taking more classes in my area. It's about taking courses that I'm actually interested in, not in this area. For example, if you're studying mechanical engineering, um, take an intro to philosophy course, take a music theory course, anything that you're interested in, take art history course, take an anthropology, sociology course. Take as many of those as you possibly can, because you know at the end of the day, if you're if you're it depends on how you think about your education. If you're going to college thinking that this is I got to do well so I can get a job, that is partially true, but it's only partially true. There's the other part where I think college is there to give you tools to process the world. And what some might call, well, the first part is intelligence. Like like y'all are really smart, and you're here to kind of really put that smarts and to acquire a kind of intelligence about how we can actually do something as experts. But beyond intelligence, there's what you might call wisdom. And wisdom is not any single discipline. Wisdom is like as broad of a of a perspective as you can give yourself. So actually taking a French literature class, taking something that, and I don't mean just randomly picking courses. Like if you're in engineering, let's pick a humanities course. If I'm natural sciences, let's pick a social science course. I don't mean necessarily that. I mean like go with your interest. Read up on, take courses, but also read up on things, or just simply read novels, read things that read, go to museums, think about stuff, and then make stuff right that aren't necessarily like on the nose trying to solve a problem, but kind of off the nose a bit, so to speak, where it's teaching you something else. So this part is the part that is really depending on you, but it's the awareness that, yeah, take courses outside of your discipline and as broadly as possible. And for me, this was kind of just the way how I rolled. I don't know why it was the way that ended up being how I rolled, but like as I was studying computer science, I took a ton of music classes. I took a Hong Kong cinema class. I took a Japan cinema class. Those are some of the music of Southeast Asia. By the way, I don't have a music degree, even though I'm a music professor. I just don't. I've taken a lot of music classes. I have only computer science degrees. I don't even have a music minor. Um, and by the way, truth be told, um, yeah, like it's there's not like a clear plan. You don't go into computer music because like you feel like I plan to be a computer music person necessarily. I was just interested in things. Um, and so, but these courses that had like really nothing to do on the surface with computer science were also some of my most memorable courses that I've taken. Like I still remember the music of Southeast Asia, songwriters workshop, Japanese cinema. That was such a fascinating class, right? And I still think about what I learned there. And by the way, years later, it's come back, and learning about kind of Tokyo Story and a movie in which like nothing really happens, so to speak, or it's just about a family going through this episode and it's about kind of daily life. Wow, that has so informed the way I think about design that it's not here to shake up the world. It's here to understand how people are living moment to moment. Like these things just come back to help you in ways that you might never know, but at the moment they're just interesting. So I have a lot more to say about this. One thing I can say is I do recommend either checking out the book, and this is the only thing that I think is uh, is not free. Everything else on my website, the Chuck, all this material on artful.design is all freely available. And but somewhere between the book the Zoom series, all this material, and I have a lot of other writing up there too. Um, there might be other ways to kind of get it. Like at least if you're interested in how I'm thinking about this, those would be places to look further.
All right, and we have one final question. Where do you get the motivation and inspiration for your creativity? And how does one create something new and unheard of?
Well, I think there's a thought that we are fashioned by what we love, uh, and I think that's kind of where I get my inspiration is actually just from taking stock of the things that really speak to you. For me, that's like video games. I play video games for like, I don't know, since I was 9, right? And I still remember the first day that in my family was like we were never rich, so it was like I finally somehow convinced my parents to get an original Nintendo Entertainment System, and I played the hell out of Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt until I had money to even buy like another game. Um, but that was endlessly fascinating to me, and to this day, I think video games inform such a big part of my design. And in that video games, there's a lot of creativity in there, but it's also a place where you can figure out if a video game really speaks to you. Why does it speak to you? Why does it feel good? Why does the play control feel good? Why does the story actually meet? Does it match the gameplay? Like there's all these things about video games you can think about. Music is another inspiration. Movies another inspiration. Um, Honestly, like anything that speaks to you can be an inspiration. And in fact, I think those make for me the best kinds of possible output. For example, like if I just observe a random stranger on the street, like doing something that made me feel that was, that's just, that's beautiful, that's truthful, and precisely because that person didn't need to do it, they went out of their way to do something good. Like I want the things I make to either feel that way or to be used in that can be used in ways that can make people feel truthful, that can, you know, enable the capacity to be just, right? And so like just seeing the actions of people around me is a huge inspiration, not least of all my parents and my friends. Like when they do things that really like speak to you, you don't there's not much you can do with that immediately, other than maybe you can say thanks, but that doesn't really capture it. It's a quiet kind of reflection that stews over years. I still remember specific things that my grandmother did for me like 30 years ago. And I think about those moments and I'm like, man, I want the things I make as an engineer to be as gentle and as thoughtful and as kind as that, right? As that moment. Um, and so I think inspiration is where you find it. It's not, you don't have to go out of your way to find them. You should go out of your way to take stock of what the things are that really speak to you. And that it's easier than you think if you just do it. So it's also kind of hard, but because it's what you're interested in, it actually ends up being like just this fascinating personal process of figuring out what is it that really speaks to me. Like media, everything that comes in, right? Books, movies, TV shows, video games, interactions, musical interactions, instruments, music, songs, you name it. It's just, I think it's the same thing that most of us consume, but find the good ones. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Okay, well, on that note, I just want to thank you so much for joining us, Ga. This was such an inspiring talk, and I hope you took away from it what I did, everyone, to really take the time, especially in this moment of pause, to take stock of what inspires us, the little things as well as the big things, and to also think about what good we can bring to the world. I'm going to think a lot about how to make myself a little more pie-shaped personally, and I hope it inspired you to do the same. So thank you again. Have a wonderful holiday weekend, and thank you one last time to Ga for this wonderful, inspiring talk.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you all for having me. Be well.